So our next speaker up is Sangeet Choudary, and I just want to say a couple words about Sangeet. So he did an unusual thing. In a former career, he was working for one of these major organizations, Intuit, and leading their innovation and new ventures, and working primarily in India and Asia, and observed the changes in the economy, and did something that's a little unusual, certainly for us academics, which is he took a dive, left the security of an established firm, and invested in really learning and understanding about the things that are happening. And then went beyond that to generating new insights and kind of recombining and building new materials. So as a result, Sangeet came to Marshall's and my attention primarily, I think, through Platform Thinking blog. And we started corresponding and interacting, and that was so productive that a couple of years ago we met here and kind of formed the partnership that has eventually led to the creation of the book cover that you've seen. So Sangeet's going to present some of his really exceptional work on the design of the interaction in the core platform. Please welcome Sangeet.
Thank you, Jeff. So I want to spend some time talking about the design of platforms today, because the single most important impact of digital is not so much to improve efficiency of what we already do, but to actually change the fundamental design of the business that we are running. Because one of the key factors that determines the boundary conditions of a business, the transaction costs, change dramatically because of digital. And I spend a lot of time helping 100-year-old businesses that we're talking about move towards platforms and build new platforms. And I often have to face what I call the platform gap. So what happens is typically I enter a meeting where somebody says, let's go digital, and the next person says, okay, are we using Hadoop? Or what's the technology stack that we're using? So there's this whole gap where when you're saying you're going digital, you're actually saying, let's peel apart what we used to do. Let's peel apart the structure of the business that we used to run, and let's restructure that business, redesign that business. And that's the part that is very often least understood, but there's actually a very structured way of thinking about it. So there's obviously a lot of depth and detail about how you do it. So I just wanted to put together a 30-minute 101 version of it so that we can start thinking about how you build businesses when digital is not merely increasing efficiency of who you are, but fundamentally redesigning you because of what it can do to the boundary of your business. So to contrast what platforms do with what we used to do in the past, and what Marshall talked about at length in terms of explaining the design of business in the industrial era, I think of the design of business in the industrial era as a pipe. I use this metaphor because essentially the design of business was linear. You created value, you shipped it outwards, and at the end of this pipe where all the value was spewing out, there was this guy called the customer who was taking that value and giving you back a specific form of currency, which was only money. There was no real-time feedback which was changing the way the business interacted with you. There was a very linear flow that would always come and hit you. So essentially, the reason the pipe existed was because value creation always requires aggregation. You need to aggregate labor and resources towards creating value. And the way the pipe helped was it would aggregate labor and resources inside a firm through a value creating process, a linear process. It would aggregate demand at retail outlets. It would aggregate attention at specific media outlets. And through all of this aggregation, it would ensure that there's an end-to-end value creation that's happening, and the whole business model would run that way. Now, we all say that the internet, digital, everything created disruption, but we don't try to unpack exactly why it happened. So the first thing that really happened when the internet happened in its consumer web form in the 90s, the first version of the internet really, or the consumerized version of the internet, really did not take the advantage of what the internet actually was. It just reimagined the internet as an extremely efficient pipe. And so the initial set of disruption stories that you see, newspapers getting disrupted because of the internet, Amazon and Netflix disrupting retail outlets, Borders and Blockbuster, all of that happened because of something very simple, zero marginal costs of distribution. you had a huge deal of marginal cost of distribution associated with physical papers or with the idea of having physical retail outlets, and so that got changed. The design of the business was still the same. It was still a pipe. It was just an extremely efficient pipe that was doing this. What happens now is that as we've learned with the evolution of the internet, with the coming in of new business models, we've seen a new form of business design emerging, which is essentially the platform, which is what we're talking about today. So if you look at the design of the platform, Marshall alluded to this before in his discussion, and what we note about the design of the platform is that the platform is no longer this linear business that's moving things in a straight line. Instead, what the platform does is it creates an infrastructure. On top of it, external producers can come in and create value. External consumers can come in and consume that value. And so the platform performs exactly two functions. It creates an infrastructure that is plug and play, and it determines the conditions of these market interactions that need to happen on top of the platform. This is something that's happening across the economy today. I'm going to take examples that we understand, so I'm not going to take the examples of the 100-year-old companies that are doing this, because there are more nuances to understand how they're doing this. But we understand how Airbnb works. We understand how YouTube works. All of these leverage the idea of the platform design of business. What's important is that when we say that there are two-sided markets over here, they are not two distinct markets. They are just two distinct roles, because one of the key things that has happened is with the democratization of the tools of production, all of us can be producers in various forms today. Whether it's with the smartphone or with 3D printing or with wearables, there's different ways in which we are producing. So the gap or the lines between producers and consumers are gradually fading. So essentially what we see over here is that the design of the platform business is an infrastructure over which there's an interaction that's happening, a market interaction. And the goal of the business is to ensure the repeatability and efficiency of this interaction. And I'll get to that in a minute. There are a couple of things that change when we move from the pipe model to the platform model. The first thing is that pipes relied on resources to compete. If they had specific access to resources, if they had access to a unique kind of resource, they could compete better than all of their competitors. So pretty much everybody who had unique access to resources, whether it was just natural resources or whether it was unique access to labor, a certain specialized skill set, it was all dependent on resources. What platforms do is they compete on the basis of the ecosystems they develop around the technology that they give out to that ecosystem. They no longer compete on the basis of resources. They compete on the basis of this ecosystem that coalesces around the platform. The second big shift that happens is in the formula of value creation. So traditionally, in a pipe, the formula of value creation was the end-to-end process that aggregated labor and resources towards a certain outcome. The way you would design a pipe business was you would design the process, and you would use that to design all of the factories, the enabling infrastructure that you needed to build to enable that process end-to-end. You would never design a factory and expect the car to come out of it. So that's really what happens when you come to platforms. That process is being replaced by an interaction. And if we say that we are going to start building platforms by building a technology and seeing what happens when users start using it, it's a bit like saying you're building a factory and hoping the car comes out of it. So the key point that I want to mention over here is that just as we focused on the design of pipes, starting with the design of the process, let's look at the design of platforms, starting with the design of the core interaction that the platform enables. A platform may enable multiple interactions, so there's a way to look at these interactions one at a time, but every platform will have one core interaction at least. So with that in mind, one way of defining a platform business model is to say that you're moving from process first to interaction first business design. Or to say that a platform business model is essentially interactions enabled by an infrastructure. The problem is that because of the physicality of the world we live in, because of the physicality of the industrial era, we don't see the interactions, we see the infrastructures, which is why the platform gap happens. The moment somebody says we want to go digital, they try to figure out how to build the infrastructure instead of trying to figure out how to focus on the interactions that will help them get there. This has interesting implications because once we shift the focus away from the infrastructure to the interactions that are being enabled, think of what the goal of the business was in the case of a pipe. The goal of the business was to ensure that the central process was A, highly efficient, and B, highly repeatable. That is how scale could be achieved. If it was efficient and repeatable, you could achieve scale. And essentially, the way you achieve repeatability and efficiency was through business process optimization, through quality control. The goal of the business, in the case of a pipe, was improve the quality and quantity of the process that is running through the pipe. In the same way, the goal of the business, when it comes to the platform, is to improve the quality and quantity of the interactions that are happening on top of the platform. In a pipe, when you improve the quality and quantity of the process that's happening through the pipe, you achieve scale. But in a platform, you achieve a new kind of scale that Marshall talked about at length, because once you make an interaction more repeatable, essentially what happens is that people start participating more. When people start participating more, even more people come into the platform to start participating, and essentially a new form of scale gets leveraged because of network effects. So the core idea of stronger network effects goes back to your ability to make the interaction highly efficient and highly repeatable. If you remove friction from the interaction, you're strengthening the network effect. If you ensure that there is high quality in the interaction, if you're encouraging desirable interactions and discouraging undesirable ones, you're helping the network effect. So the network effect is no longer about building huge bases of producers and consumers. The network effect is about looking at the interaction and saying, where is the interaction failing, and how can I remove that point of failure from the interaction. So let's see what this looks like if we go into it a bit deeper. Let's talk about platform design. This is how we usually look at platform design. What's the monolith that we're trying to build? Because traditionally, a lot of thinking in large organizations even today around platforms is that it's an IT prerogative. And traditionally, the whole look or the whole idea of building IT has been extremely monolithic. So very often, as I mentioned, organizations start with technology. So the first principle of building platforms is do not start with technology. Instead, start with the interaction, design the interaction, and use the interaction design to enable the design of the infrastructure. So let's break that into two parts. If we are to look at business design, we're talking about first start with the design of the interaction, use that to design the infrastructure that you're building. Let's look at what the interaction looks like. Let's forget platforms. Interactions have always existed in this world. And all social and economic interactions involve three kinds of exchanges. There's an exchange of information on the basis of which supply and demand meet and decide to interact with each other. And then there's an exchange of goods and services. And in exchange, there's an exchange of currency. So the actual interaction is always an exchange of these three things together. If I was to compress that, the way I would think of an interaction is the producer creates value, and a consumer provides some currency in exchange for it. Even if one of these things breaks, the interaction fails. So you could create a platform where everybody is creating value, but if you fail to communicate feedback and the right forms of currency to the producer from the consumer, you're going to fail at your ability to repeat that value creation on a sustainable basis. Let's look at what this means when we think of platforms, because what platforms do essentially is they take an interaction and they internalize parts of it that can be made more efficient because of the platform. So essentially what platforms do is they focus on the interaction and internalize, remove all kinds of friction that could come in the way of the interaction. So let's look at the first part of the interaction that we often think of when we think of the platform, because the platform is something on top of which somebody else is building something. Usually it is a producer building some form of value on top of the platform. The obvious way of thinking about value is apps, but everything that we see over here, Airbnb, producers are building availability of accommodation on top of the platform. If the platform did not exist, that accommodation would not exist. So they are actually building something because of the platform. YouTube, Kickstarter, all of these cases are essentially there's some kind of value being created on top of the platform. And when I think of value, very tactically speaking, there can be many different ways in which we look at how value is created on platforms. One is, of course, you have innovation in the form of apps being created and extension of the technology that the platform had. But depending on the kind of goods or services that are exchanged, if you're exchanging virtual goods in the interaction, content is created on top of the platform. If you're exchanging physical goods, availability and information about the goods that enable supply and demand to meet in the form of a product listing is created on top of the platform. Let's look at services. There are certain services which are highly standardized. A ride on Uber is very standardized. A stay on Airbnb is very standardized. You can create a standardized service as a listing on the platform. Or there are a whole range of services that are not standardized. Think of TaskRabbit. I could walk a dog, I could do 100 different things, but I don't put all of them as standardized services. So what matters as value, what is value on that platform is essentially the availability of a service provider. And if you think of Nest and Waze, what is value on that platform is essentially the data that is being created by something that is connected to the platform. Even something like Nest has network effects, implicit network effects. Nobody's talking to somebody else, but every thermostat is learning from every other thermostat. So there are implicit network effects involved. Just like Waze has implicit network effects. Every car that is streaming traffic data is helping build the community of traffic information, the community knowledge around the traffic information that helps everybody else take a decision. So my main point over here is that if we look at what acts as value on the platform, that fundamentally decides what is important as a metric. If content is value on the platform, then the number of producers is not important. What is more important is the repeat participation of producers and their ability to scale content creation and the liquidity of content, how fast just content get consumed. Instead, if non-standardized services are value, then what's important is the availability of the service provider, not just the number of service providers, but how often and how available the service provider is on the platform. So depending on how we define value on top of the platform, it helps us define the one key metric that determines value creation on the platform. Let's look at the other side of the interaction. So in exchange of value, there's always some form of currency that a consumer provides to the producer. And the key thing that the platform needs to design is ensure that this currency gets fed back to the producer. This is often not very intricately and very deliberately designed, because very often we think that if the producer is doing his job, he will, and if he sees something happening, he will kind of continue participating on the platform. But it's important to figure out what are the various forms of currency that the consumer can provide the producer on our platform. I'll just give a few examples. Money is an obvious currency that if the platform can actually capture the transaction, it enables that transfer. Reputation is a form of currency. Producers may participate on a platform to gain reputation. If you take a ride on Uber, they actually ask you to rate them five stars because that helps them get more rides in the future. Influence is a form of currency. I don't participate on Twitter for anything else except for the influence that it gives me over time. And all of these things, if you really think of it, is currency, and the goal of the platform is to figure out how to communicate this currency back to the producer. If it does not do that, it's coming in the way of the repeatability of the interaction that we just talked about. These two things, ensuring that there's value creation and ensuring that there's the communication of currency back to the producer, is what enables what is called the feedback loop on the platform eventually. And if that breaks at any point, the platform fails. In addition to this, as I mentioned, there's feedback, so there's explicit ways in which feedback has to be created. This is an example of Medium. So if you put up something on Medium, it has very explicit way of conveying feedback about what's happening with what you created on Medium. In addition to this, what's important is that platforms should create a sense of progression, because if you want to have repeatable interactions, you need to ensure that your producers feel that they're progressing on the platform. LinkedIn is able to manipulate us into giving them all of our career data by creating some form of progression. I mean, in that case, it's very tactical. It's a progress bar that shows how much of it is done. It asks your colleagues to help you fill your resume and things of that sort. But there are other forms of progression. And I find it really useful to study game design over here, because games are so addictive because they encourage progression throughout the game. At every point, they make it just easy enough to go to the next level, but just hard enough to go to it too easily. And a similar dynamic is really important when designing platforms. So all of that coming together brings us at the end of what is the first half of designing a platform, if you will, at a very high level, which is how do you first start with the interaction that you're enabling. The next thing that's important once you've decided the interaction is to go and talk about the infrastructure. What is the infrastructure that's going to enable this interaction? And this part is really interesting because platforms straddle something which is a sort of conflict of priorities. To enable interactions, platforms need to be plug and play. They need to allow users to plug and play easily. So a platform needs to be extremely plug and play because producers and consumers should be able to easily get onto the platform and interact with each other. But the problem with making something plug and play and making it highly open and participative is that two kinds of issues ensue. One, when everybody comes onto the platform, whenever you let everyone come onto something, you're going to have desirable and undesirable interactions. So you need to figure out a way to encourage the desirable ones and discourage the undesirable ones. So you need to have a governance mechanism for the platform. The second issue is that when you create an open and participative environment, you're inviting the problem of abundance. There's going to be a lot of abundance. And with every problem of abundance, there's a problem of search costs. The consumer is going to have a much more difficult time finding what he's really looking for, and that's going to break the interaction in the long run. So essentially, what platforms need to do is they need to balance these two conflicting priorities, build something that is open and participative, but at the same time, it's highly curated and governed. The way they do it is they do two specific kinds of things. Platforms manage some form of access control for producers, which determines which kinds of producers are allowed, which kinds of actions they're allowed to do. And on the other side, they manage a filter which determines what is served to consumers. Between these two things, they essentially manage the balance between open participation and curation and governance. If you look at access control, platforms are gatekeepers at the end of the day. Not irrational gatekeepers, hopefully more rational ones, hopefully more scalable and more efficient, but they are gatekeepers. And as gatekeepers, they need to ensure that they determine producer access on the basis of certain parameters. And as a result of that, they encourage desirable interactions and discourage undesirable ones. If you look at it at a very high level, there are 3 points of access control on any platform. You could control access at the point of platform access itself. So the example that I think of here is SitterCity. It's a platform that enables parents to find babysitters. So babysitters can join the platform only once they go through a whole manual curation. And that's a curation at the point of platform access. Based on who you are, signals of your reputation, of platform reputation are incorporated into determining whether you get access to the platform. The second point of platform access or access control is that you can access the platform, but your ability to produce is restricted, and that's what Wikipedia does. You can access the platform and you can make a few small edits, but for the really large influential edits to happen, you need to build influence on the platform first before you can do that. So there's another form of access control that can be levied at the point of production. A third form of access control can be levied at the point of distribution. And this is really interesting because Medium started as a traditionally gate-kept platform. You had editors deciding what was good and what was not. At one point, they decided that if they were going to scale, they had to scale their curation at the rate of scaling their ecosystem. Otherwise, the whole thing was going to break. So what Medium eventually did was they let users create collections and build followership for those collections. And once they opened out the platform to all sorts of writers, all of these users who had collections became the new distributed editorial workforce. So what you can do on Medium now is you can create something. There's nothing stopping you from producing. But if you want to reach the market of readers, you have to pitch your creation to one of these editors, user editors on Medium. And so there's a new access control that is being created at the point of distribution. So through a combination of where you create access control and where you allow it to be open and participative, you can manage what kind of stuff gets produced on the platform. Which leads us to the second part of the issue about managing this conflict, which is on the consumption side. And this is where the filter becomes really important, because in a world of abundance, the value lies in the filter. The value today is not in aggregation, it is in the filter. Craigslist worked in the 90s because the value was in aggregation. And today, it's built really big network effects, so that's fine. But every platform that comes up today really creates value in the filter that it builds to make sense of the abundance. And there are many different kinds of filters. I think of filters as, filters could be about a user's intent. So a search query on Google is a filter. It's filtering all of the index pages and showing you exactly what you need. A location, when you switch on your mobile phone for Uber, you're essentially setting your location as a filter, and any car that passes through it is being shown to you, and the most relevant one is passed on to you. So intent filters are active intent like a search query, or they are context filters like a location. Where are you? Who are you? Who are you is a filter that Facebook has. So the whole news feed is a filter based on what you did in the past, what your friends did in the past, what you liked, what you did not like, and who you complained about. All of that comes together to decide what gets shown to you in the future. So a really important part of platform design is the design of the filter. What are the factors that go into designing the filters? What are the factors that make the filter stronger with every user action that happens over time? Because that's the real role of data. Data comes in and keeps on strengthening the filter, and over time the user gets more hooked, not because there are more people producing on the platform. That's not the network effect anymore. The user gets more hooked because the filter scales at the rate of the scaling of the ecosystem and delivers the value of the network effect on a consistent basis. If your filter scales at a rate slower than the scaling of the ecosystem, the value is actually going to go down for the user as the ecosystem scales. And we've seen that happen very often with quite a few platforms. So that together is essentially what happens if you think of the design of the platform around the interaction. As I mentioned, there's on the basis of this exchange, there might be an exchange of goods and services outside the platform and currency outside the platform. Some of it may be tracked. For example, Uber tracks the exchange of the service. A lot of others do not. Some of it may not be tracked. So let's take a few examples. Twitter is a really simple example to think of. No access control on the producer side. Very simple filters, just time of access and who you follow. Everything else doesn't really matter. What you're served is based on only these two parameters, and you're paying back with influence. Airbnb is slightly more complex. There's editorial and social curation on one side. Photographers come to your house, people rate you up and down. On the other side, there are certain parameters on the basis of which listings are filtered and shown to the user, and the traveler pays with money and reputation. So let's bring all of this together into one single way of thinking about how we build platforms. Essentially, what we talked about so far was platforms are interactions enabled by infrastructure. You start by figuring out what your interaction looks like, design the interaction, and use that to design the infrastructure that will enable this interaction. So let's start with the interaction. What a platform does is it acts as an infrastructure for value to be created on top. So for that to happen, you need a producer, you need certain kind of value to be created. I defined what the taxonomy of value is to kind of remove the confusion around that. But there's the producer that comes in, there's the value that needs to be created on top of the platform, and there's finally the idea of the consumer coming on the platform. Let's start with these three building blocks as the first three building blocks of what an interaction looks like. Once we know who the producer is, what value is being created, we know that there needs to be a platform under it, and it needs to offer certain kinds of tools and services to enable this interaction to happen. At this point, we also need to balance the conflicting priorities of open participation with curation and governance. And that's why we need to define two things. A, what are the channels by which the producer accesses the platform, and how are we putting in access control on those channels? B, what are the channels by which consumers access the platform, and how are we putting in filters on those various channels, and how do those filters scale over time? In a similar manner, how does access control scale over time? Because if it's only manual, how do you ensure that it scales at the rate of the ecosystem? Essentially, what happens on the platform is things moving from the producer into the platform through this model of access control, and then things being filtered out, going to the consumer. To do this, the platform needs to do three things in particular. It needs to provide tools and services for creation. I talk about tools and services because very often we focus just on the technology part of it, but there also need to be enabling services of various kinds to ensure that producers create and create often. They need to be tools and services of consumption, and they need to be tools and services of curation so that the platform scales its ability to decide what is good quality and what is not. This lays out how value is created on the platform, but for this to be repeated, for the feedback loop to happen, you need to have a way of communicating currency back to the producer from the consumer. But all of this is great if you're running a charity. If you're really running a business, you need to have value capture at the end of it. This is a really interesting point because value capture traditionally has only meant dollar capture. On platforms, value capture can mean data capture because data does very interesting things. If you are a 100-year-old company building a platform, you could be using that data to sell more of what your pipe sells. If you're the platform and you're not making money on a particular interaction, you could be capturing data from that interaction that can be used to strengthen the filter for another interaction where you actually sell something. So the way to think about capture is to ensure that in every interaction, you're either capturing dollar or you're capturing data. Because it's very simple to say that we want to be free and we want to create a huge user base. Until that point, we don't really care about how we're monetizing. It's fine not to monetize on day one, but you need to know what data you're capturing that can later be converted to dollars. And that's a really important point about the capture part over here. So far we talked about the interaction enabled by the infrastructure. I just want to wrap this up on the idea of the fact that platforms are actually multi-sided in nature. They don't just have a single producer and a consumer. A lot of platforms are very complex. How do you build platforms using this approach? Putting it in a very simple way, the way I think of it is, if you think of LinkedIn as a multi-sided platform today, it has all of these different kinds of users plugging into the platform and playing with the platform. If you think of LinkedIn, LinkedIn was not built one side at a time. It was actually built one interaction at a time. So you can actually build out a multi-sided platform, building it one interaction at a time in the mechanism or in the model that I just showed. Think of LinkedIn. It started with professionals interacting with professionals. So there was a very specific kind of interaction between two parties. LinkedIn enabled that. What LinkedIn captured in this interaction was data, because it got all of the data about the various professionals. That data helped it set up the filter for the next interaction, which was recruiters interacting with professionals, jobs being served to users based on the data that they had already entered. And LinkedIn realized that the repeatability of the interaction is very important, and for repeatability you need to make this a daily habit, and LinkedIn today is not a daily habit. So then they layered another interaction. The jury is still out on whether that interaction is very useful. I've actually removed all of the LinkedIn thought leadership posts that I get, but the idea of LinkedIn doing this was how can we layer an interaction that increases the engagement on the platform. So essentially, one interaction at a time, LinkedIn created a multi-sided platform. So the unit of analysis for a platform to me is not a side. It is an interaction, because the unit of value creation is not a side. It is an interaction. I believe this is really important today, because the future, if we believe in platforms, is going to be interaction first. We've already seen this happening in various industries. Telecom pipes move to platforms. Accommodation, hotels working on a pipe model are struggling and being disrupted, and we've seen this in traditional publishing and a whole range of industries. The idea essentially is that if we still think that platforms are about building technology, we've got it wrong, because platforms are about enabling interactions. Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions?
Tour de force, Sangeet. Phenomenal to watch your growth over the last few years. Outstanding. The way that you do platform control is actually really interesting right now in terms of how muscular your response is to managing platform access.
Yeah.
And now it reads on regulatory effects. So if you look at why Airbnb is able to continue to be non-regulated, whereas Uber just got smacked, the muscularity of their response, when you drop below 4 stars, you remove the player from the platform. Now, in a regulatory fashion in this world, you look like an employer. Whereas Airbnb, you're not taking that muscular effect. You're just letting them have a 1-star rating and not get accessed. So you've got a looser stance. Do you have any thoughts on that generalized, or do you want to get into that in any more detail?
Well, there's a whole regulatory aspect of it which is still not solved in terms of where do you draw the boundary line between a partner in the ecosystem versus an internally controlled resource. So there's a whole issue around that. The other part of it in the whole Uber Airbnb debate that I think is quite interesting is that all of these platforms view their producers in very different ways. In the case of Uber, a ride is so commoditized that it actually shows in how Uber thinks of a driver. It shows in how they curate them. It shows in how they do what would be called traditionally community management. So Uber's approach to getting more ride drivers on the platform is extremely mechanical. We'll help you get access to loans. We'll help you come onto the platform. We'll help you get set up, and then it's up to you what you make of it. Airbnb's approach to this and how they manage access control, but also behavior design in a way, is a very different model because Airbnb believes that the actual interaction that's happening is highly dependent. Even though it's standardized, it's highly dependent on the kind of experience that the host can deliver to a particular traveler. So their whole mechanisms of access control and their whole mechanisms of community management accordingly are very different, less mechanized, very human in comparison. So to answer that, the first part of the answer in terms of the regulation, in terms of where you draw the boundary line, the jury is still out on that, really. There's a whole discussion. But in terms of the kind of culture that you end up building on how you control access, how you encourage behavior design, it gets heavily influenced by the way you look at your producers. Uber looks at its producers as somebody who can be replaced by what's happening in a Carnegie Mellon lab today. Whereas Airbnb looks at its producers in a very different manner. And that fundamentally changes how they look at access control and behavior design. Okay, great.